Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I leave my car and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. I've just dropped off my car for my daughter, who will need it a little bit later in the day, and I'm walking home. Well, I just listened to a strong episode of So Very Wrong About Board Games, and they were reviewing a topic that they did a long time ago called teaching games or something like that. And I enjoyed the episode, and I realized I don't know if I've ever done that before, or if I have, it's been a long time since I've talked about that here on the podcast. So I thought I would talk today for my walk home about my approach to teaching games, what I like, what I don't like, and give you some insight into it. The long and short of it is that I feel a lot about teaching board games the way the So Very Wrong About Games guys do, although there is one crucial thing they left out, so we'll get to that. So generally, I'm going to talk about how I teach complicated games. Although my approach to teaching simple games is similar, it's just faster. But the complicated games are harder to teach, so I'll start with those and work backwards to simpler games. To start with, for a complicated game, first thing I'll do is talk to people who are going to play, arrange that we're going to play, and give them a link to a how to play video. Now, not everybody's going to watch it, not everyone's going to have time to watch it, but generally if one or two other people have watched it before you go to teach it, that helps a lot because they'll often remember things that you didn't remember. Now, of course, the experience is much different if I'm teaching a game I've had a chance to play. So I'm going to operate here on the idea that I have played the game before. So let's say that I was going to teach Ark Nova right now. That's a very different experience than if I'm teaching a game I haven't played before, but the preparation is a little bit different. So if I have not played the game before, then generally my preparation for teaching a complicated game is to first watch a how to play video. I do this because it gives me a path to take in my mind through the rule book as I'm reading. I have a sense of context for what the rules are. I don't always do that. Sometimes I'll just jump right into a rule book first, but I like it if I'm able to grab a how to play video first. Then I will read the rule book. If I'm thinking ahead or thinking thoughtfully, I will consult the player aids that are available for that game and see whether or not those are the player aids that I want the players to have. By way of example, when I recently learned and taught evacuation, I decided that the player aids the game came with were insufficient. So when I'm Board Game Geek and found a couple player aids that people had made and printed those out so that people would have more access to those. This is also true of a recent play of Coimbra I did. I went and printed out some player aids for Coimbra, mostly because both of those games have a lot of icons and no words on the different components. So you have to pass around icon legends, and generally people don't have those handy, and the game doesn't usually come with them, or it comes with one on the back of the rule book, and that's insufficient for my taste. So I will usually make some player aids or copy some player aids, print out some player aids if I can. So this is all in the service of prepping the game. I also generally, if it's a new game, I'll punch it and sort it and prepare it for setup. So I go through the rules for setup and I look at what do you have to do in setup. And I generally package the components in a game based on setup needs. So for example, if as a player, you get all the pieces of a certain color and then you get the money, that your starting money and some resources or something, assuming that the game has enough resources where it's not burdensome to have some missing, I will put all the resources that you start with in the bag with the player pieces so that at setup I can toss you a bag and that gives you everything you need to set up your station. That varies by game, of course, but that's generally my approach. I'll often then package components in the same way. Components that need to be separated are often packaged in separate containers, although sometimes that just depends on how annoying it would be to separate them and how much extra work it makes at the end of the game to have to separate them out back again. So again, this is all preparation before I actually start the teaching process. Then when we're going to play, if I get there first, I will set up the game for the number of players and kind of get everything in place where I can. That way I'm not making players impatient while I'm figuring out where everything goes. This is an important part of the process because a lot of players find it boring to sit while you're setting things up. And what you don't want to do is start the game process by having players feel bored. If the players are there during setup and it's possible, I will give them things to do. Hey, can you please put these tokens on that board? Hey, can you shuffle these cards? So that not only does the game get set up faster, but they also don't feel useless sitting there while I'm setting things up. We're past setup. We're ready to do the teach of the game. This is the place where I differ dramatically from the so very wrong about games people. And in fact, I think I fit much closer to Richard Ham or Rado in the way that he talks about game teaching and game learning, which is I start with the theme. For me, what we're doing in a game is about the community we're making around the table and about the story the game is creating. Sometimes that story is very theme forward, meaning that what you're doing feels really thematic. Sometimes it's sort of a light sprinkling of artwork on an otherwise themeless game. Either way, I like to know what the story the game purports to be telling is. Sometimes I'll introduce that verbally. As often as not, the rulebook has a short paragraph that provides that theme, and I will read that aloud or ask someone else to read it aloud. This sets up what the game is, establishes the story of the game. Then I will make sure, if the game did not properly establish it, I will make sure to establish who the players are in the context of the game. What are we doing? Who are we? What is our purpose? I find that it helps you to learn what the rules are and why they work the way they are if you know what your role in the story is. Human beings are storytelling creatures. This is where I reconvene with the so very wrong about games folks, because the next thing I do is I start with our objective. What are we trying to do? In other words, how do you win? We are trying to do this, and here's how you do it. So in Seven Wonders, we are trying to build our civilization in a way that earns the most points. You get points through playing cards to your civilization space, called your tableau, and the points are added up at the end of the game. That would be kind of the introductory part to Seven Wonders. Once I've sort of introduced what we're doing, then usually the next thing we do is talk about game flow. It depends on the game. There are occasionally games where some other thing has to come first. So there are occasionally games where some other thing has to come first, some other explanation of broad concepts, but generally I will start with the flow of the game. So again, I'm just going to use Seven Wonders throughout. I'll switch it up. What did I say? Ark Nova. So I might say, I would explain how you win. You win when someone's two scoring pieces connect, then that triggers the end of the game. Everyone else gets one more turn, and then we add up points. Then I would talk about the flow of the game. I would say Ark Nova is played in a series of turns. On your turn, you're going to select one of your action cards in front of you and do what it says on it. Then you'll move your action card down to the bottom of this list, this row of 5 cards, and it's the next person's turn. Wherever the card that you select is in your line of cards, that's how much power that card has when you activate it. So the further to the right it is, the higher number it has above it, the more powerful the action. That might be how I'd introduce the flow of Ark Nova. Then I would point out the board and talk about how the individual cards work. So as quickly as you can get into how the game actually works, the better. If there's rounds and turns, you might say this game is played in a series of rounds. In each round, each player gets one turn. Or you might say, that'd be like brass. Or you might say in brass, you would say each player gets a turn. And then in the next round, the player who spent the least money in the last round goes first. For other games, you might talk about how the round goes as long as you have actions to do. In Orleans, you're going to place your discs on action spaces, and then we're going to take turns using those action spaces until everyone has passed. Some players might pass before others. They will just sit out and wait until the round is done. So again, we start with theme. We explain who we are and what we're doing. Then we talk about how you win. Then I explain the rhythm of the game, and then I'll explain individual turns. Generally, I will explain big concepts when they become relevant for individual turns. Brass is a useful one there because brass has a couple really big concepts that you have to understand in order to play the game. Some people might be inclined to explain them at the beginning. They might be inclined to explain how the resources work, how the selling things work, how the networks work. I don't do that. I start the game, I talk about how things go, and then I'll introduce those segments as I talk about the early turns of the game. For me, the context becomes the sort of mental hook you can hang the idea on so that you can understand what's going on. If you don't have the context, it's really hard to hang on to why you would need to know that or where to put that information even if you do remember it. Having the context is crucial. And for me, the narrative side is the crucial way that context becomes, or that information becomes contextualized. To go back to brass, there's the rule about beer. Well, it's really useful to explain what I think as the game player, what I think the beer is about. And I'm like, the beer simulates the fact that a big part of business is about relationships and negotiation. And so when you sell something in brass, using a beer represents building a social relationship with that person, and that playing a crucial part in making the sale. So you need to have beer available to represent that. That's an example. From the Vladimir Suchy game, like evacuation is very thematic. I know I haven't talked about it yet on the podcast, but one way to think about that is, you have your materials in the old world and you have your materials in the new world. As you pay for things in the old world, you have to use resources in the old world. It makes sense because that's where the resources are. Sort of explaining things through the theme gives players a way to understand what they're doing. And then finally, once I've kind of explained the ebb and flow of the game, then I would remind people, so the game ends when this happens, and then here's how we determine the winner. So I've kind of told people twice what your objective is. Often at the beginning time when I'm explaining how you win, I will also mention what makes the game end, because I hate when people find the game ending and they didn't expect it to. So a couple more things about my teaching style. One, I do look for pitfalls. On So Very Wrong About Games, they called this the splatter effect. But the idea is that there are some things that if you don't know they're there, as a new player, they can really get you. An example would be playing Blood Rage. It's useful to know there are some cards by which players can win a battle by losing a battle. If you play some of the cards for Loki, you get points by losing, and a player who gets a lot of those cards can be very effective. Similarly in Seven Wonders, I'll talk about the science cards in Seven Wonders are often spread out among people, but if one person is able to get a lot of them, there are a lot of points available for them in Seven Wonders. I also would talk about in Seven Wonders, often getting a lot of cards from the same color will give you bonuses. I don't know if I say that very often, but I particularly will talk about like the science scores dramatically more the more of them you have. So keep an eye out for that. I try not to do that too much. Mostly I'll look for places where making a mistake can cost you dramatically. With Nucleum, for example, I would caution people to be careful about which tiles they're using as their railroad tiles, because if you give away all of your tiles that do a certain action, then the only way you can do that action is to use your wild tile, which is not very effective. So I don't generally offer too much strategy, but I will sort of do warnings for potholes. Another thing that I do that I actually got from the Shut Up and Sit Down video about teaching games. One is I try to give people their pieces right away so they have something to fiddle with. And two, I try to answer questions if they come up. And this, I think, also puts me at odds with a lot of other games teachers. A lot of people don't like a question to come up in the middle of a teach and don't want to answer it. My approach is that the person who is asking that question is asking it because it occurred to them now. Somehow in the teach, that idea has come up. And if I can answer it quickly, I will do so, because I don't want that to bother them as they're trying to listen to the rest of the rules. Like, can you play this when it's not, can you play an action card when it's not your turn? Or an event card when it's not your turn? I don't know what game that would be, Pandemic. And if I'm like, I'll cover event cards later, and then I keep teaching, well, somewhere in their head, their brain is going, well, but what about event cards? Can I play them when it's not my turn? So if I can answer it quickly, I will. Or often I'll give a partial answer and say, I'm going to do more detail about that later. Like somebody would say, can I build, do I have to build stuff in my network in Brass? And I don't know why I wouldn't have addressed that already, but or do I have to does the shop have to be in my network to sell something in Brass? My answer would probably be, it doesn't. I will explain that in more detail later. So I like to answer questions as they come up, but I'll often defer complex explanations to later. The last thing I do caution them is, I learn and play a ton of games. I might very well miss something. I apologize in advance if I remember a rule later, but I want us to play by the rules, so I'll do my best. If I remember something I forgot to say later, I will bring it up as soon as I can, and we can decide how to deal with it based on how late in the game it is and how big a deal it is. So I've had games where I mention a thing and we realize we played 2/3 of the game the wrong way, and we're like, well, we'll just finish the game the wrong way rather than suddenly changing how the game works and let some people benefit from that rules error and other people not. Other times we've just changed the rule because, this is the rule, it turns out. Let's play it correctly. So a lot of that depends on having players that give you a little bit of grace, which is important to me as well. So what teaching tips did I miss? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and share with me which tips you would add as part of your instructions about how to teach a game right. I'd love to hear them, and I can't wait. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.